As I start, I'd like you to write in the chat, hello everyone. Could you just hit a word in the chat about who you are, whether you're an interpreting student, if you're an interpreting teacher, or maybe something else. I'd just like to, it would be nice to know who I'm speaking to. And while you're doing that, I'm going to get down to my manuscript because for some reason it wasn't where I left it. It never is it? Here we are. Okay, so lots of students, but also practicing interpreters with long experience, I see, and all types of interpreters as far as I can see, medical, legal, conference. Very nice to have you here, all of you. I should first of all also, of course, thank the University of Massachusetts at Amherst very, very much. And I should also thank Cristiano and Jan for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm also happy to see so many of you here, both of students and of active interpreters. If you have heard me before, you may find that some of what I say is a little bit repetitive. I tend to repeat my hobby horses, but I hope that I will also be able to bring something new too. As we are many here today, you cannot ask questions while I'm presenting. We'll do the Q&A at the end. You can, of course, write things in the chat. Jan will moderate that and we can save the questions till the end. Okay, so let's see if I can get my, yes, here we are. We're talking today about dialogue interpreting. And here I have illustrated it in its most pure form. You can see that this is yours truly in the middle. And this is a staged example, which I will be daring and show you more about later. Dialogue interpreting like this, when you are 3 persons sitting in a triangle, might be the very pure form of on-site interpreting. I'm not sure how much we see it today. Dialogue interpreting tend to be your, squeezed between a bed and a doctor, or standing, hovering over somebody sitting, or dialogue interpreters end up, if you're even on site. I mean, many of us are not even on site. You might be on the telephone or on Zoom as well. But let's stick with this idea of the interpreter in the same place, at least as their participants. And also, just for the example of it, let's see the interpreter here in the middle. When I talk about dialogue interpreting, I'm not sure we're using the same word. You may use public service interpreting for this, or community interpreting. But what I see dialogue interpreting as is actually a mode. And I'm going through that mode in the following slides, and you can comment if you agree with me that this is dialogue interpreting for you as well. Yeah, that would look like an attorney-client meeting. I agree with that. So dialogue interpreting for me is one, oh, and before I start this is very important, of course. If I have sign language interpreters here, I didn't catch that in the chat, I'm sorry. But if we are sign language interpreters here, then in my experience, I know that might be different, but in my experience, most of the sign language interpreting we do in dialogues are simultaneous. So obviously, if you are a sign language interpreter and I talk about dialogue as short, consecutive, or other things, it might be a little bit different for you, as sign language in many contexts are simultaneously done, even in dialogues. But anyhow, if you're a spoken language interpreter, I would argue that dialogue interpreting is one mode of interpreting together with simultaneous or consecutive. It can be described as a short consecutive, almost without notes. The interpreter may, of course, use notes depending on what is being said, but it's this really kind of short sentences where you would work without notes. Sometimes dialogue interpreting becomes quasi-simultaneous. Oops, sorry about that. And with quasi-simultaneous, I mean that the change of dialogues, the exchange in the dialogue is so fast. So the interpreter goes on to overlap or even speak at the same time as the speaker without going over to whispered interpreting, because that's something else, of course. The dialogue interpreting would be used in encounters with few participants. It's not very convenient to use this type of very short consecutive when you have many participants in a meeting. And also it can be used, I don't know why my slides are doing this to me. They always do. I have a really bad slide technique. I'm sorry about that. But they can be used both on site and remotely. Remotely, of course, is a little bit different, because when you use it remotely, the flow will not be the same. I'm sure you can agree with me on that. The flow when you do it on site, on video or telephone, is different because you manage the dialogue differently. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into dialogue interpreting, and I'm here on this slide. I have some linguistic fundamentals as well about dialogue interpreting. So I have argued in several things I've written that interpreters' renditions are a target text of a preceding utterance and a point of departure for the next source text. This may seem very technical, but what I mean is that if I work in dialogue interpreting, my translation is based on what you just said. And my translation is also what your counterpart will be answering to. So your counterpart will not be answering to your utterance per se, but actually to my utterance. So this is what I mean with this target text of a preceding utterance and the point of departure for the next source text. When you work as a dialogue interpreter, you're close to the participants. That's sort of one of the fundamentals of dialogue interpreting. You're sitting, at least if you're on site, you're sitting right there with your participants. And you also form the hub of the interaction. Remember the picture I showed you, the interpreter is really there in the middle as a hub of the interaction. And in terms of your tasks, you monitor the participants' contribution to the dialogue. And with this, I mean that because the participants can only, well, they can, I guess, but if it's going to be an intelligent dialogue, they have to wait for your interpretation to take the word. So therefore, it is also part of the interpreter's task to monitor the participants' contribution to the dialogue, although typically that goes very smoothly. This is probably not things you think about when you interpret, and hopefully your participants will not think about it either. What you also do is that you ensure comprehension between the two participants, or three, and with this I mean that it's not like you're asking them, do you understand? You might, but you don't. But you are, by seeing their reactions and by checking what you're saying against their reactions, you ensure that they comprehend. And the interpreter has an active role in the turn-taking. I'm going to talk a little bit more about turn-taking in my next slide, but it is the interpreter's responsibility to see to that the turn flows from one to another. So turn-taking, I talked about monitoring when I talked about what the interpreter does, and monitoring, turn-taking, and coordination are really central concepts in this. So now we are at turn-taking and coordination. So what the interpreter what the turn taking is the sequence of a talk when one speaker has the exclusive right to the word. Turn taking is, you might know it, and I'm sorry if I repeat it, but turn taking is really something that exists in any type of conversation. As soon as two or more people starts to talk, there's this kind of turn taking going on. We know when it's our turn to speak typically. So the turn is the sequence of a talk when one speaker has the exclusive right to the word. It's about who is, I'm sorry, I don't know why it jumps around like this. It's very annoying. I really can't get this to work. Okay, you'll have to look at all of it at the same time. So it's really about who's talking when, and who decides who can talk, right? And this is not a decision, again, just like you as an interpreter does not sit and say, now it's your turn, or now you can speak, or now you have to be silent. But this smoothly flows between the participants. Who can talk and who decides who to talk to? Just the simplest part of that is that if I ask a question and I look at somebody, and then that somebody will understand that, okay, you're the one, I'm the one who should answer that question, right? It is based on common and mutual norms, and there are differences, which is related to language, culture, and gender. The three people here in the slide are the people who did a lot of work on that in the 1970s. Furthermore, turn-taking in interpreting is identified as crucial for dialogue interpreting. If turn-taking does not go on, it's not dialogue interpreting anymore, right? And this was established by interpreting researchers in the 1990s. And finally, it is a sine qua non, so it goes without saying that the dialogue interpreter coordinates the dialogue implicitly. And with this I meant what I said before, that I don't, as an interpreter, tell someone that now it's your turn and now it's your turn, but rather that flows implicitly in the discussion. So now that I've gone through what the interpreter does, I'm going to show you a short example. And here comes my very daring part, because now I'm going to stop my slide share and show you a short example of an interpreted sequence. And what I want you to do now is look at, so this is staged. I would like to stress that again. So I'm going to stop share my slides and start share the video. And if you don't see the video, then I suggest that, so now I've shared it, so you should be able to start seeing it. If you don't see it, I suggest you write in the chat and I will be told if somebody cannot see it. I'm hoping, I forgot to check. Let me just check that I have optimized this for sharing. Yes, I have. Okay, so here we go. So this is a short video. It's a staged talk between a daughter of a person who has gotten a stroke and the doctor and the interpreter. It's between French and Swedish, so you're probably not going to understand it. It doesn't matter if you understand it or not. This is not the important thing here. What I want you to do now while I'm showing this is to look at me as the interpreter. I'm me here in the middle, and what I do with my body. You can also listen to what I do with my voice, like, or other things, okay? So look at me and what do I do with my body in this short sequence. We're going to look at a minute of this. And don't worry, it's nice if you hear, but don't worry if you don't hear, okay? And just so you know, you will not understand. So here we go, and hope that everyone can share this.
Det är generellt allvarligt och det tar ett tag innan man blir återställd. Man kan bli återställd, men man kan också få bestående men.
AVC, c'est sérieux pour commencer. Ça prend du temps pour se rétablir. On peut être complètement rétabli, mais on peut aussi avoir des problèmes permanents.
Så generellt sett så det är för tidigt att säga vad det här kommer att innebära för din pappa.
C'est trop tôt de dire quelles conséquences aura votre père.
Men jag tänkte också att vi skulle prata lite grann om själva rehabiliteringen här. För Josef då, Vi kommer avvakta ett par dagar, men han kommer att få påbörja sjukgymnastik redan här på sjukhuset.
Et on va parler maintenant de la rétablissement de votre père, parce qu'il va devoir rester ici quelques jours, Joseph. Et on va commencer le rétablissement, la physiothérapie déjà ici à l'hôpital.
Okay, so now you've seen 1 minute of this short conversation. I'm going to show it to you again. And what I want you to look at now is what do I do with, now I'm going to be more specific, okay? So we're going to look at the same clip again and look at who do I look at when I speak? Do I always look at the person I'm speaking to? What do I do with my pen? Does my pen serve anything here? And also, once again, look at how I take the word. And so where do I look? Does my pen serve a purpose? And what do I do with my eyes? Okay. Sorry, I have to go back. Here we are again. So same minute. And again, don't worry if you don't understand.
Ja, för en stroke det är generellt allvarligt. Och det tar ett tag innan man blir återställd. Man kan bli återställd, men man kan också få bestående men.
AVC, c'est sérieux pour commencer. Ça prend du temps pour se rétablir. On peut être complètement rétabli, mais on peut aussi avoir des problèmes permanents.
Så generellt sett så det är för tidigt att säga vad det här kommer att innebära för din pappa.
C'est trop tôt de dire quelles conséquences aura votre père.
Men jag tänkte också att vi skulle prata lite grann om själva rehabiliteringen här för Josef då. Vi kommer att avvakta ett par dagar, men han kommer att få påbörja sjukgymnastik redan här på sjukhuset.
Et on va parler maintenant de la rétablissement de votre père, parce qu'il va devoir rester ici quelques jours, Joseph. Et on va commencer le rétablissement, la physiothérapie déjà ici à l'hôpital.
Så att sjukgymnastiken börjar redan här och sen så får han med sig.
Yeah. I've got some good comments from Christiana already, so I'm going to use them and talk a little bit about what I think I do. And you're, of course, if you don't think I do the same thing, you're, of course, welcome to challenge me. So I vary between looking at the participants and looking down at my pad. And also, I think that you can see that I stare into the void. So I stare at the camera at some point. I'm listening. If you go through this clip several times, you will see that I'm listening to the intonation of the speaker. And when the speaker dips down in her intonation, I identify that as what we would call a turn transition point. A relevant transition point. So this is a point where I feel that, oh, maybe here I can take the turn. You see me at one point also overlap the speaker. And I also, yes, like somebody said, I'm also looking very intensely at the speaker when I want to signal that you can go ahead now. I use my pen. Actually, what I'm writing is that I only scribble. I don't really take notes here, but I use it to turn my gaze away from the speaker so as to give them room to look at each other, but also as a sort of remembering. I use my pen as a prop to remember when I interpret. Okay. Let's see what somebody, I like when you finished interpreting the sentence, you look back at the clinician as a clue to indicate, yeah, exactly, that I finished interpreting. So what I wanted to see here is everything that goes on now we're beyond the words or the terms, but all these little details going on that the interpreter does. And all this would lead us, now I'm going to try to exit here and resume my slide share. Here we are with my slides again, I think. Yeah, and full screen. Okay, so what this leads us to believe is that there must be a lot of things going on in the brain here. You can make a lot of assumptions about the cognitive processes in the interpreter's head. And what I have done together with my colleague, Birgitta Englund Dimitrova, is that I have suggested this basic assumption about the cognitive or the mental processes in your body, in your mind. And that is that the fundamental conditions of dialogue interpreting, so this is the three-party dialogue and the immediate feedback, that has impact on the process requirement. So this means that what I can do, because I'm right in the middle of the dialogue and I get this immediate feedback all the time, and I can, of course, I can also give the immediate feedback all the time. That is that it puts more cognitive load on the interpreter's monitoring, coordination, and also ethical awareness. I'm not talking so much about ethical awareness today, but I'm talking about monitoring, coordination, and turn-taking, and how that puts cognitive load on us, and what we also can do with our performance if we learn to master it. So the fact that because you're right next to the parties, that put extra cognitive load on you. And cognitive load, these are the things in your environment or within you that requires more brain effort. They are the things that makes it more difficult when you interpret. And this can be anything from the difficult word or the fact that somebody never stops, but also to these small things that you saw me doing. Who's talking now? Who am I looking to? What signal am I giving? And this comes down to something which would look like this. And this is the interpreting process for you. Ta-da, in dialogue interpreting. And what we see here on this slide is in the top rectangle, you see the words perceiving, understanding, transferring, producing, and coordinating. And this is what I would call the cognitive or the mental components of interpreting. So these are the things that your brain needs to deal with when you're interpreting. You need to understand, to perceive that somebody is talking. You need to understand what they are saying. You need to transfer that to the other language. You need to produce it in the other language. And you also need to do all these small coordinating things with the participants. The other part of this is what lies behind the big blue egg, which is the cognitive load, the things I talked about, which can be anything from you realize you forgot to pick up your daughter at daycare, and this will be a major cognitive load for you if you're interpreting, or the speaker just takes so long utterances, so there's no way you can remember everything they said, and you have to start taking notes or decide where to cut them off or so on. So this is the big blue egg, your cognitive load. The other two parts here is the professional self concept. I'm not going to talk about that so much today, but it is you yourself as an experienced interpreter and how you see and understand yourself, how you can make use of all your previous experiences. I think that you have had Rachel Hearing here speaking, maybe not this term, but the term before, and she speaks a lot about this professional self-concept of the interpreter. Monitoring is what I also tried to show you, how the interpreter understands and controls the whole interpreted event. The interpreted event, which is the blue rectangle at the bottom, is what I can see, or as an interpreter or as a researcher or as the participants. Everything, all the other squares and eggs and so on, they go on in your mind. But what we can see and observe is the interpreted event. Anyway, I'm going to dig in a little bit more into monitoring because I think that this is an important part of to understand the interpreting process. the interpreter monitors your own interpreting process. So all these 3 or 4 words like perceiving, understanding, transferring, producing, and coordinating. But you also monitor and coordinate the turn taking of the other participants, and you plan ahead of the interaction. So the fact that what I say is something that is going to get a response from the other party means that I have to plan ahead. When I say this, how is this other party going to react? And I have then suggested that monitoring is crucial to 6 different sub-processes of dialogue interpreting. 3 which are active when the interpreter listens, and 3 which are active when the interpreter speaks. And when the primary parties, so the 2 participants in the process that you're interpreting for, when they speak and you listen, you monitor your comprehension of that utterance. You monitor the relationship of that utterance to what you just said. So when the primary participant responds, does he respond to what I just said? Because if he doesn't, then it might have been understood wrongly. And you also monitor your own memory and processing capacity, which means that you're active thinking, okay, can I remember this? Do I need to take notes? Should I interrupt? And when the interpreter speaks, I'm sorry, there's a lot of words on these slides, but when the interpreter speaks, you monitor your own utterance, meaning that what I say, does it make sense in the language I say it? The relationship between what I say and the primary parties. Oh, I'm sorry, the slide is blurry. The relationship between what I say and the primary party's previous utterance. So this means that does what I say now make sense to what that person said before? Because otherwise I might not have understood it correctly, right? And I also monitor verbal and nonverbal reactions of the primary parties. Do they look like they've understood? Okay. I hope this one is better because it's less words on it. So therefore, I have proposed, again, together with my colleague Birgitta Englund Dimitrova, that the interpreter's monitoring is a cognitive or mental process through which the interpreters can observe, evaluate, and also take actions, like repairing what you say or stopping to ask for a repetition or something like that. And take actions in relation to your own cognitive process and that of the other participants in the event. So what I'm trying to tell you here, that all the small things I do is labeled monitoring, because that is what I do in order to make the interpreted conversation run smoothly. So this leads us to the strategies for turn taking in dialogue interpreting, which I promised I talked to you about, and what, based on what I've seen in my research, you could use or need to know in dialogue interpreting to make it successful. And before I start to talk about them, I'll give you a list of what I suggest. But maybe you could give me some strategies that you've thought about in the chat to see what kind of strategies you use or think you're using or like to have handy when you interpret in a dialogue. So if you think about interpreting in dialogues, please give me some examples of different strategies you know you're using or you could use. And if you really quickly need to open the window or run for a second coffee, this is the time to do it. Pre-session, like I guess that would be planning before your event. Hand gestures, nods, hand gestures to request a pause, Oh, your professor is Rachel Herring. Yeah, so you've probably been here, heard a lot about that, but that's not a strategy. Gazing, clearing throat, that's a nice strategy as well. I noticed when I look at myself that I use a lot of in order to take the word. Oops, sorry. Here we are. Overlapping conversation, exactly. If you need to break the turn, overlapping could be a really good strategy. To be well prepared beforehand is good. And where you positioning yourself between the parties is really crucial, and it can also be very difficult because in so many situations you're not allowed to, or allowed in quotation mark, but to ask for a certain position. And yet it can really be the thing that changes comprehension. And the tone of the voice is good to use. Yeah, listening for when people are sort of sounding as they're finishing. And prediction, of course. Thank you so much for all these ideas of strategies. Let's see if I can get here are mine. And it's basically, I think, what you've said. It's about gaze, how you use your gaze. I think that gaze can be a really, really powerful tool if you know how to use it and if you exercise using it. I also think that many are good at using it, but do it totally without thinking, unconsciously. So if you can learn to use it consciously, it is a great, great tool. Your breath, as somebody said, or clearing your throat, and your body language, whether you turn to somebody or, as you noted in the short video, how I used, really to look at someone when I was giving them the word. Your notes, whether you take notes or not, but using your notes as support to look away from the participants also. The utterance length, how you handle the utterance length of the other parties. I mean, whether you can break the utterance length or not. And the mode, whether somebody said overlapping, and the overlapping is a really good, also a good and strong tool. And you can also even start in a quasi-simultaneous, because you interpret as they speak, and thereby you use your cognitive resources in a sensible way. Central position implies impartiality, says someone. Oops, sorry about that. I'm ahead of my slides again. This is really annoying. Here we are. And that is true, but now we're not talking about impartiality. We're talking about cognitive constraints. So I'm going to refrain from answering that. If one party speaks to me instead of the other party, I usually lower my eyes in order to encourage them to look at each other. Yeah, that's a really good tool to use your gaze to encourage people to look at each other rather than on you. Because obviously you probably know that, but if you don't know that, if you haven't tried it, try it. If you're in an interpreting situation and you start looking at someone, they will start looking at you. I mean, it's so strong. It's such a strong tool of contact, so that if you gaze at someone, eventually you will get their gaze back. At least that is my very strong experience. Okay, so I have some tentative conclusions from my research, which I've not talked about so much today, but I'll try to tell you now very shortly what I've done and how what conclusions I've come to through my different research studies. Experience has an impact on the interpreter's cognition. I have compared inexperienced interpreters with experienced interpreters in many, many different contexts. And if you have a lot of interpreting experience, so meaning that you can read the room, you know what to do, and if you have a lot of context experience, so this was not the first time you interpreted in a court or in cancer care or so on, you offload a lot of cognitive load from your brain So you know how to act in this situation, you know who the speakers are, maybe you even know the names if you have a lot of terminology. This is of course prep, but it's experience too. If you know the terminology, if it's not new to you, then that means that you don't have to think about it, or you don't have to focus on that. And that means that you have a lot of cognitive effort left to deal with other things. I have also looked at the language knowledge of interpreters, and it turns out that if you put eye tracking glasses on interpreters and see where they are looking when they are interpreting, you can see that when they are interpreting into the language that they have said are their weakest language, they look much less on the two participants and much more onto the table or straight into the void. And when you avoid gaze and you look into the void or down at your papers, it indicates that you need to concentrate more. So this means that my result meant that when interpreting into the language, which you say is your weaker language, you need to concentrate more. So therefore, it takes a lot more of cognitive effort from you. So it impacts how much cognitive load you're feeling, how much mental load you have. It makes it more difficult to interpret into that language. And also, perceived and actual language proficiency may have an impact on your process. So this means that if you think that you're not as good as one language as the other, you may be worse interpreting into that language. Even if me with my instruments, when I measure you, I will say that your language competence are equal. But if you in your head thinks that one is worse than the other, it will put extra cognitive load on you. If your increased cognitive load may impact your process, I think that is what I've tried to argue all the way here, that if you, for some reason, experienced an increased cognitive load, like I forgot to pick up my daughter at daycare, it will take your focus off what you're doing, and that increase your cognitive load. And finally, and this might be important to remember, there may be, I'm not sure yet, but I think that there's a universal cognitive constraint to dialogue interpreters' working memory, meaning that when I have looked at how long stretches interpreters can go for, and this is not just the speaker's original utterance, but if we take the speaker's original utterance and the interpreter's utterance, so the two turns together, we call that a coupled turn. A coupled turn is what one speaker said and what the interpreter interpreted, okay? So when I measure these two, the two turns, the coupled turn, and how long that can be, I can't find differences between different interpreters and different languages, okay? On the average, of course, there are individual differences, but I can't find an average difference. So this means, and when I compare inexperienced and experienced, when I compare different languages, etc., etc. So I've not decided that this is the case yet, but I think, and also thinking, because if we think about what memory research tells us, memory research says that we have a limit as to how much we can remember in our working memory. So I think that there may be a cognitive constraint, which is somewhere between 6 and 9 seconds. So this is what you can remember and then interpret, okay? And if you know that, of course, then it's easier to know when you have to start taking notes to help your memory, or when you have to break down turns to make it easier. And what you need to know about this, and this is the metacognitive awareness that I was talking about in my abstract, if you read that. Your metacognitive awareness is what you know about your cognition and how you can work with this. And if you have metacognitive awareness, you know about the cognitive challenges that you have to deal with when you're interpreting. And when you know about them, you can prepare. And we know that success comes to the prepared, right? So things that are cognitive challenges when you interpret are language asymmetry. So which one of your language do you need to work more on? Sorry to say that. The pace, how fast are people? Can you ask people, or can you use other types of strategies to slow people down? Terminology, of course, that goes without saying. Compact information, how much information is given in that utterance, and can we break it up? And emotions. If I break down, or if my participants break down, then that's a major cognitive challenge. I'm sure you can agree with that. And this has taken me to 5:45 and time for some questions.